Okay, so in this final tutorial, we're going to look at an overview of global patterns and trends in the availability and consumption of energy, including the relative and changing importance of hydrocarbons, nuclear power, renewables, and new sources of modern energy. So first of all, this is a stark warning to us here in this graphic. We have reached the peak of world oil production. So if we look on the left-hand side of this, we can see that, oil production rapidly increasing, cheap and easy to extract oil. And now we're moving into this era where it's becoming increasingly harder to access oil. It's expensive to access it. And so we're seeing falling quantities of production. Of course, that's a seller's market because low levels of supply mean higher prices. So if we take a look at all of our energy sort of hydrocarbons, we can see here in this composite graph, look, that there is our peak level of production in crude oil, and then it starts to fall quite dramatically from there. And remember, this is a composite graph, so we're looking at the thickness of the color. Heavy oil C, the thickness of the oil as we go through, remaining relatively the same, hard to extract, expensive to extract, but levels not particularly falling in that time period. Natural gas having a peak here around sort of 2050 and then falling in width. Can you see that, to much lower levels by 2100? Coal not really changing, so not changing dramatically. So coal still being with us, still having, it's actually the dirtiest of fuels, but yet actually not falling in numbers greatly in that time period. The big change here, of course, is not so much nuclear or hydro, not seeing significant changes in that. But we are seeing significant changes with renewable energy. In fact, renewable energy trying to fill that kind of energy gap that will emerge. But we do need to stabilize. We do need to stabilize our kind of demand for energy, because I'm not so sure at this point renewables can fill that kind of demand supply gap. We take a look at kind of consumption of energy and look at the pattern of change from 2012. We can see that all of these regions, so non-OECD, other non-OECD and OECD nations, well, demand has increased across those groups. Demand has increased most for non-OECD Asia. And you can see there that significant increases in demand. Of course, this is representing the growth in demand for energy as countries transition into industrial nations, so middle income countries predominantly, showing that increase in demand. If we take a look at oil consumption around the world, this is quite an interesting, it's an outdated graphic actually, look, it's 2009, but it still gives us quite an interesting pattern. You know, we often think about North America, in particular the US, being this sort of, has this huge demand for oil. But when we look at North America as a region, it reaches 22,826,000 barrels of daily consumption. And compared to total Asia Pacific, which is 25,000, of course, bigger population here, that has to be said, a huge population here, but so using more oil. Massive demand also in Europe. So these industrial nations, these transitioning nations, all consuming high levels of oil. But of course, per capita consumption here would be much lower than in North America. But if we look at that per capita consumption, we can see it in USA. It's 20 oil consumption. So what they're saying here? Oil consumption in millions of barrels per day. So USA by far the biggest nation of consumers, and so therefore its per capita consumption would be much bigger. China, the second biggest here, look, 13.2, but a much larger population, so much lower per capita consumption. India, 5, the third biggest, and you'd expect that, of course, another huge population there, population of close to 1.2 billion people. So when we think about electricity generation, a very important thing, because we use some of these hydrocarbons to produce electricity, we can see that the growth factor here is seen in renewables over time. So renewables increasingly important for electricity production, and coal not really getting any smaller. Coal's still very, very important in China. Natural gas seeing increases, moderate increases in nuclear, and petroleum really not that significant. Hydrocarbon for electricity production, electricity generation. But the big growth being seen in renewables. So when we look at global renewable power capacity, this graphic here shows kind of the importance of different energies. Look, the biggest contributor is hydropower, massive dam projects that produce renewable energy. Not particularly good for environmental systems there, but they don't produce greenhouse gases. They are clean. It is renewable, and it's fair. It has seen some moderate growth. Wind power being a big grower, and solar PV energy rapidly expanding as we move in this period of time. But what about future? Let's just look at renewable growth here. And this is making the point that solar PV is this big grower. Wind energy too, but this is where we're seeing most renewable energy coming from. So solar power enters a new era, it says, becoming the undisputed leader in renewable power capacity growth. PV also accounts for 60% of the upside potential in the accelerated case here. So in this particular, we can accelerate use of renewable energies. It will come from solar PV. Again, this graphic here, if we look at a projection into the future, into 2050, we still see this big expansion here of solar PV energy. Wind farms offshore and onshore reaching a similar level, but not seeing the same kind of rate of growth. So that's these three here are really, really important. And we start to see here, look, the falling importance of coal and some of the hydrocarbons. So when talking about relative importance, they're not going away, are they? They remain important, but their relative importance is falling in relation to renewable energies. This graphic shows European countries in terms of the absolute and relative impact of green technologies and renewables within their economies, Germany being the leader, United Kingdom following behind, and Germany is renowned as that sort of this, having had this kind of green tech revolution really in terms of its energy. So low carbon generation technologies are increasingly cost effective. This research done by Lloyds suggests that 70% of its respondents believe that renewables are reaching a cost parity with fossil fuels. So that will increase their relative importance. We're also seeing emerging cleaner energies in the car industry. So hydrogen, electricity, biodiesel, ethanol, propane, all of these types of kind of alternative energies are being seen in various countries. Brazil being quite famous for its use of ethanol. And actually, if we look at Europe has pushed towards hydrogen fuel cars. So here it says in its push to become climate neutral by 2050, the European Commission has unveiled an industrial strategy called the Clean Hydrogen Alliance, a public-private partnership among the EC and Europe's fuel cell and hydrogen industry. So, one of the kind of barriers to electrification of cars is the infrastructure. They kind of compete with each other, and we can't have kind of hydrocell fuel stations alongside standard charging points for electric generated cars. So that kind of barrier needs to be sorted out and maybe needs to be looked at the regional level. So Europe perhaps choosing for hydrogen fuel cars. And going back to the Lloyds survey, so supercapacitors will play a big role. So in terms of technology innovation, we can improve energy storage through these supercapacitors. We're going to be able to localize our energy grid a lot easier. This graphic here shows you the kind of battery versus the supercapacitor. So here it has high power densities, surface charge storage at low energy densities, much higher life cycles within these supercapacitors. So that's one of the barriers in terms of moving towards renewables and the electrification of our mobility or our transport infrastructure, the problem with batteries, but that's getting better. Another aspect of innovation is through blockchains. And what are these? Well, this idea of a blockchain enables individuals to produce renewable energy and supply that and target that towards specific consumer groups. So, for example, you might have solar panels on your house and you might supply it directly to these charging points at stations for cars, and that is certificated green, and so it's very much a transparent system of making sure that your electricity has a renewable source.